TED Talks have taken us to the farthest reaches of the universe. We've toured the galaxy, we've walked on distant planets, we've swung around, come back home to our own home planet Earth, where we've seen its most beautiful and sublime places. We've zoomed into the microcosmos, where we've looked into the eye of an insect, and we've seen worlds on the head of a pin. And in that spirit, I'd like to take us on a brief journey of the human universe, and specifically of those 4.5 million people who call the Puget Sound region home. And the reason is this: Puget Sound is in trouble. From habitat destruction to water pollution, our shorelines don't function properly, our rivers and streams function at 10% of their biological capacity, our forests are never allowed to live past their adolescence. And just as a doctor or an engineer seeks to understand the systems that they try to fix, that they try to make better, we too try to improve the human system, and we try to understand the human system. Because of all the problems plaguing Puget Sound right now, virtually all of them have at their core human behavior. So when we look up at the stars, at first they appear random, but if we look closely enough and we use the right tools, we see that there's actually structure, that there is some order, and that there are connections between all of them. And when we look at the human cosmos, we see that it too at first looks random, but if we use the right tools and we look at it in just the right way, we begin to see connections between everybody. We all have connections. Our friends, our family, our coworkers, our neighbors. Some are close, some are mere acquaintances, but we all have connections. Social scientists refer to these connections as social capital. Now, social capital at first may sound fuzzy and esoteric, but social capital is a very, very real thing. And I ask you when you're driving home today to consider the level of trust that you extend to every driver on the other side of that yellow line. What other species places its life in the existence of a yellow paint stripe? We, of course, don't trust the paint stripe, we trust the people on the other side of the paint stripe. And these bonds of trust and altruism and communication are the backbone of society. Indeed, without social capital, civilization would literally collapse. Social capital is what brought you all here in this room today. Through your connections with others, you were all invited. Social capital is what got about half of you your jobs. Social capital is a very practical thing. It's the matrix through which all social change occurs. Social changes like technologies, behavior patterns, innovations, all spread through this matrix of social capital through a process called diffusion. Diffusion is nothing less than the sum total of millions of decisions by millions of people. Diffusion is what brings a lot of our familiar day-to-day things into our hands. Does anybody here have one of these? Anybody have a cell phone? Raise your hand. Just a few decades ago, nobody had ever heard of one of these things. This was the stuff of science fiction just a few decades ago. Now virtually all of us have one. Now I ask you all, please turn off your cell phones for the rest of the day's presentation. This is a behavior pattern that we are trying to diffuse amongst the people in this room. Has anybody ever heard of a ballpoint pen? Raise your hand. Just a few decades ago, nobody had ever heard of a ballpoint pen because they didn't exist. This is another product brought to you by diffusion. Does anybody in this room recycle? Recycling is an example of a behavior pattern brought to you by diffusion. So we as environmental managers, we have this long, long list of things that we hope people will do that are beneficial for the environment, a long list of behaviors. We have this long list of behaviors that we hope people will do. Take natural yard care, for example. Natural yard care is something that we often say, wow, I wish people would do natural yard care. I wish they would practice this behavior. But when we look deeply, we begin to see that natural yard care is actually comprised of about 100 distinct behaviors. It's not just one behavior. And each one of those component behaviors is comprised of many other decisions. So in fact, when we ask people to practice natural yard care, what we're asking them to do is to make literally thousands of decisions. And we hope that they're deciding correctly every time. So my case in point for this, I'd like to introduce to you our subject, our case study, Dave the homeowner. Dave the homeowner is a good egg. He tries hard, takes good care of his family and his home. He's good at his job. When we ask Dave if he cares about salmon or the orcas or water quality, he'll say, yes, I care. But there's not a day that goes by when he ever thinks about the plight of the orcas. He only thinks about salmon when they land on his dinner plate. He doesn't know the first thing about water quality. Dave is a sharp guy. He has 140 IQ, but he doesn't know what a catch basin is. He's never even heard the expression non-point source pollution, and his notion of a watershed would make any environmental educator squirm. So we find Dave in his yard, working, doing a little bit of spring cleanup. Hey, I got a weed. It's a weed right there. Hey, honey, we got a weed. Well, I don't know what kind of weed it is. It's huge, about 4 inches. Hey, yo, Ralphie, I got a weed. Well, I don't know what kind of weed it is. It's huge, about 4 inches. Dave now begins combing through his memory cells, trying to remember everything he's ever heard about a weed, from his friends, his family, his coworkers, his neighbors, none of whom are botanists, none of whom are plant physiologists. Well, let's see, I guess I can either spray it or I should pull it. What's that, Ralphie? If I pull it, it might come back. Ralphie doesn't know the first thing about weeds. Well, I guess that means I better go spray it then. Dave now goes into his car and he drives to the nearest hardware store, where he finds the clerk. The clerk is a good egg, takes good care of his hardware store. The clerk has about 30,000 items on the shelves, and the clerk makes an effort to try to know a little bit about each one. His sole knowledge of pesticides is in a 1-hour presentation that he had 2 years ago from the manufacturer's representative. The clerk walks Dave down through the store, and they turn into an aisle that's filled with pallets with big bags and colorful plastic spray bottles and an array of exotic aromas. And they stand together and they read the labels on the bottles. Well, let's see, this one here fixes this weed and this weed and this weed, and this one here will take care of that weed, and this one here will take care of these weeds over here, and let's see, well, this one here has all 3 of them rolled up into the same bottle, so they mix it together and it kills everything. Yeah, I'll take this one, liquid death. This'll work, this is the ticket. Dave now takes the product, walks over to the cashier to make his purchase, but not before he finds that nice new OG router bit that he's been eyeballing for the past few weeks. He drives home, goes into the garage, puts the product on the shelf in the garage, and spends the rest of the afternoon routing beautiful edges into random scraps of lumber. 3 weeks later, we find Dave working in his yard again, and again he spots the weed. Oh my gosh, there's that weed again. What should I do? I guess I could pull it or spray it or... Now, the range of options available to Dave are exactly what they were the first time around, except now in Dave's brain there's only one option. I've already spent the money on that spray. I guess I better go use it. Dave now goes and walks into the garage to go get the spray. He carefully unwraps the safety packaging off the top, gives a quick glance to the label, and emerges into the yard. He takes aim and fires. Well, that was anticlimactic. Didn't look like it did very much. Dave unloads the clip into the weed. Still doesn't look like much. Oh well. A week later, Dave comes back and checks for dead. Now, we all do this sort of thing. We all take the advice of people who don't know a darn thing about what we're asking them about. We all do irrational things. We all do things that don't quite make sense. We all do things that sometimes go against the values that we would otherwise state. We all behave a little bit more like Homer Simpson than we'd like to admit. But that's part of human behavior. That's part of what we are as a species. So trying to understand how do we work our way through these relatively simple decisions? We as social marketers treat the decision to go and spray pesticide on a weed and put poison into the environment as a single decision, but in fact, in this case, it's over 20 decisions. So there are multiple points here which we, as people who are trying to influence behavior, can actually influence change. Do we, in fact, spend time trying to make Dave more aware of his options in the hopes that he might choose the right one? Do we spend time with the clerk so the clerk can give Dave better advice? Do we spend time with Dave in his backyard? Can we tap him on the shoulder somehow and say, "Hey Dave, don't pull that trigger"? All of these are decision points. They're potential points of influence. So through today's presentations, you're going to see a lot of people talking about a lot of decision points. And I urge you to pay attention to those decision points that they're focusing on. Who's making the decision? How are they making the decision? What's the basis for the decision? What are all the influencing factors for those decisions? And I urge you, when you go home today, to think about the decision patterns that you do in your own life. Because quite frankly, your own life may depend on it, and certainly the health of this place we call home depends on it. Thank you.